So, news out of the European continent is that Finland is looking to join NATO. Good news, bad news? Personally, I feel that it is bad news, and I'll explain why it's bad news. So, basically, Finland is looking to apply for the membership, and what it means that it will fill out an application and apply for a membership to NATO. Now that it strongly feels that Russia is not looking to settle for just Ukraine. That's the understanding there in the European nations now, that Russia is not going to stop at Ukraine. That's the consensus. So you can't blame Finland for doing this, but Finland and Sweden both are looking to join, and I feel that it's a bad idea, and I'll explain why in a second. But as I listened to, this morning I was listening to Sergei Lavrov and Putin himself talking about how it would directly threaten Russians if Finland and Sweden both were to join NATO. Well, it's a bad idea to them, because what that means to the Russians is that not just membership is on its way, but bases are on their way. So geopolitically speaking, it is not a good idea at this point for Finland to apply for NATO membership, let alone join NATO. That's my assessment. And I looked at this for a few days to see if there's unknowns that I can come up with. And the unknowns are, number one, China would naturally at that point realize that this is basically expansion of NATO, and NATO is going to make it clear to everyone that it's expanding, and those who are not with NATO are basically at this point against NATO. So it's understandable from the point of view of other nations that are watching the Ukrainian invasion by Russia and have decided to stay neutral, like India, for instance, Iran, North Korea, Pakistan. There's several other nations there that basically remain neutral. So now at that point, what happens is you're simply letting the other neutral member nations know that you could take sides now and either pick Russia or pick NATO. Naturally, when you look at NATO and how it's set up, according to the Article 5, attack on one is an attack on all. So this is why it telegraphs to the others, like China, which is also watching this thing very closely, because it is looking to do its own invasion of Taiwan. Recently, they were doing drill rehearsals, which indicates a pre-invasion type of movement there, militarily speaking. Why would you do rehearsals of a specific nation? Doing drills is perfectly fine. All nations do military drills to stay sharp and alert. But then when you're doing rehearsals, you are targeting a specific nation. So that's at that point no brainer that China is looking to invade Taiwan, and that's coming. And I made a video on it. You can look it up. And myself and other analysts that are looking at this Chinese behavior, we can tell that it's getting geared up. So going back to Finland and the application to NATO, and why I thought it was a counterproductive idea at this point, to allow Finland to join NATO or even apply to NATO. And I understand there are different viewpoints there, but mine is, why poke Russia at this point when we are looking to salvage a pretty bad situation there, with Ukraine being torn up in many pieces. So this clearly tells Russia that we are basically arming ourselves, and we're gonna even antagonize you in some way if that's what we want to do. So it makes a bad situation worse. So my point is, there are quite a bit of unknowns there, and I always, when assessing situations, specifically when it comes to invasions, you have to look at the unknowns, and there's unknown unknowns, and there's unknown unknowns. So by studying the unknowns and the various factors that happens as a consequence, this is not going to set well with Russia. We already know this. It's not going to make other nations that are neutral feel like they would be okay if they didn't take sides and stayed neutral. So that was my point, and why it's bad for the West and Finland to join NATO at this point. And this is why I said it is not a good idea, because it basically puts other nations that are neutral at this point in a position where they have to decide something, either for or against NATO, for or against Russia. We know where Iran would stand. We know where North Korea would stand. Legitimately, we know a couple of these nations that are basically not for NATO, like North Korea and Iran. But what about China? China was basically trying to stay neutral. And if we do this, if we allow Finland to join NATO, and fast track to NATO for Finland means by the fall, Finland is a full member. That's what fast track means. And they're going to expedite that at this point, because they know Finland is kind of nervous, and watching Ukraine being demolished. No one can blame Finland for that nervousness, but prudence dictates at this point that Finland should just sit tight and not worry that something would happen to it, because it had some basic agreement with Russia that Russia would not invade or take any military actions against Finland so long as it's not pursuing the NATO agenda. NATO is not necessarily looking to expand, but when someone applies in Europe, they would, at this point, seriously consider it. And you can't blame NATO for doing that either, because NATO is trying to protect all its member nations and those who might be threatened around those NATO members as well. So that said, it creates a whole different kind of a global scenario where other nations would have to pick sides, is what my point was, and we shouldn't have to deal with that at this point. And by provoking other nations into taking sides, we are creating kind of an hostile environment, if I may, that already makes a bad situation worse, with regards to Ukraine being torn up into many pieces there, at least that's the way it appears right now. So anything could go wrong and escalate the situation into worse. And my assessment is, in my analysis, is simply that Finland and Sweden applying for NATO membership is a bad idea. And I think that NATO should hold off on giving them full membership, because it really creates a geopolitical environment that no one at that point knows exactly what could happen to Europe, and exactly what happens with other nations that are wanting to somewhat stay neutral at this point. So let me leave it at that right now. And I explained my reasoning for why I was not for Finland joining NATO at this point, because it simply escalates the situation into worse category. So let's leave it at that. Come back to it in a few days, try to monitor and see if there's any other events happening around it, because I'm sure Russia is going to try to escalate that from their end, and we have to watch and see what they do from this point on with Finland joining NATO.